In this video, I want to give you an introduction to Visual Basic in Access. I want to first talk about computer programming and how Visual Basic is a kind of computer programming language. Then I want to go more specifically into information about Visual Basic itself as it relates to Access. I want to talk about the modules in Access, what they consist of, including declaration section and the procedures that will go into the modules. Then following that, I want to talk about characteristics of those procedures, including grouping, style, types, and scope. And then finally, I'll wrap it up with a review. Now, these concepts are difficult to understand, so you may do well to pause this video as well as go back and listen to it several times. You need to get these concepts in order to dive into the concepts and the details of programming in Visual Basic. So first, let's talk about computer programming. Computer programming is where you give a set of instructions to do a desired task. Now that seems sort of vague and a little crazy, like what in the world does that mean? But let's put it in parallel with real life. You may give your spouse instructions about running errands. For example, you may tell them to go buy groceries, go to work, pick the kids up from school, and get gas. Those are all instructions that you may give your spouse. Well, the desired outcome would be that you have food, you keep your job, your kids are safe, and you have gas in your gas tank to get around. So what I want to say is that there can be a parallel between real life and computer programming, because in computer programming, again, you're giving it a set of instructions to have a desired outcome. So Visual Basic specifically is one kind of computer programming language, and again, you give it a series of instructions to have a desired outcome. And in Visual Basic, like most computer programming languages, you have to give those instructions in a certain logical order. Now let's go back to a real life example. You could tell your spouse, go to the store, go to work, and deposit a paycheck. But what if you don't have enough money in the bank to buy the food at the store? So really, in truth, the logical order would be to go to work so you could earn money. Then you would get a paycheck and you would deposit that paycheck, and then you could go to the store and buy food or whatever you needed. So that's a set of logical order of steps that have to be gone through in order for it to work. Because if you don't have any money in the bank account, then you can't, well, you hope you don't bounce a check. You know, you can't write a check. Anyway, Visual Basic instructions, like real life, have to be in a certain logical order. Now there are two ways to enter Visual Basic instructions, which are also known as code or statements. A standard module is one way, and I'm going to go ahead and show you what a standard module looks like. Here's an example of some standard modules that are in the navigation pane. And so to show you what one looks like, I'm going to go into design view of this particular standard module, and here It's just a bunch of code, Visual Basic code. So returning to our presentation here, I've shown you now a standard module. Then now I want to discuss a class module, because that's another way that you can enter Visual Basic instructions. And so I'm going to show you an example of that now. Now, a class-driven or class module is an event-driven module. And you can come over here and see this after update event, for example, that's in relation to this particular text box. And I can come here on the build button and I can see Visual Basic code as it relates to that particular text box. So as you can see, standard modules are kind of like what you may have learned about before with macros, standalone macros. So standard modules are kind of like standalone macros because both appear in the navigation pane and you create them outside of a form or report. And then for class modules, you create them inside a form or report, just like with event-driven macros. So there are various parts of a module. First, there's a declaration section at the top of any module, and that gives information that the entire module can register or see and know some of the settings about that particular module. Then underneath that declaration section are procedures, okay? And procedures are just sets of code. They're groupings of code. And so a grouping of code would be what is called upon to execute. And so a certain kind of grouping of code might be a subroutine, also known as a sub, or another kind of grouping of code is functions. Subroutines, you may pass values to them, but they do not return a value. On the other hand, functions, you may pass values to them and they return a value. Now, in each case, a subroutine or functions, keep in mind that there are sets of code within those procedures. So for a subroutine, there's a set of code and it has an ending to that subroutine. And then with functions, there is a set of code within that function and there is an end to that function. Now I want to reiterate something that I reviewed a little bit ago, and that is standard modules are standalone as opposed to class modules, which are event-driven and based on forms or reports. Now the last concept that I want you to understand is the concept of scope. And that's a little bit complicated and difficult, but basically scope is about where a procedure is available to be called by another procedure. If a procedure is considered to be public, then all other procedures within the database can see that particular procedure and call upon it to execute the statements within that procedure. If the procedure is considered to be private or stated as private, then the availability of that procedure depends on the location of that procedure and what module it's in. Usually, standard modules have public procedures in them, and private procedures usually are in class modules, and so aren't available to be called from another class module. So now I want to summarize all this information that you've just heard, because it is pretty heavy duty and difficult. And so I would just want to talk to you about these concepts and just reiterate them a little bit here. So the first thing I want to say is that computer programming languages execute code that perform a desired task so that they have a certain outcome that you're looking for. And Visual Basic is no different. It is a computer programming language as well. And in Access, Visual Basic code is typed into modules. And there are two different kinds of modules. There's standard and class modules. Modules hold procedures that hold code, and those procedures are either a subroutine or a function. The scope of a subroutine or a function determines if it is available to other subroutines or functions outside its module. So I hope that you can absorb this information. It's a lot of information. Certainly feel free to go back and listen to it again and make sure and take notes. Thanks.